Hello, welcome to the Melee Arcane Guide. Today I'm gonna go through all the Melee Arcanes, I'm gonna tell you what they do, where to get them, and most importantly try to help you understand them so you yourself can decide better when to use which. Now, usually I try to not focus on which arcane is the best or worst, I just talk about them, give you some examples of where they're useful, but with melee weapons, one of them absolutely stomps the rest and is the strongest choice like 90% of the time. At least. So let's actually get it out of the way first. Melee Influence is an utterly overpowered arcane that can drop from the Fragmented Boss on Deimos. It can drop from Whispers in Albrecht Laboratory missions or Graslings in non-disruption missions, or alternatively it can be bought from Birch 3 for standing in Sanctum Anatomica. It has a 20% chance to trigger when you proc electricity with your melee weapon, and when it does, it will give you an up to 18-second buff that will spread all your melee elemental status effects to enemies in up to 20 meters. So when you proc Influence, you will get an 18-second window that will duplicate all elemental melee status you proc to every single enemy within 20 meters of you. This would already be very strong for things like Corrosive, Vyromagnetic, but it's ridiculous when it comes to Blast, Gas, or Electricity, because all three of those do AoE damage. What happens is this: you trigger Influence and then proc Electricity, Blast, or Gas, sometimes even all three. They spread, tick, and the planet explodes. It doesn't work well with weapons that have very low status chance, we're talking 10% or lower, and it's not necessarily great for slow heavy hitting builds even if they have decent status, but it kind of outperforms everything else on everything else. The downside of Influence is that it's an AoE arcane and it doesn't do anything on single target. If you have one enemy, you have nowhere to spread the status, so you get no overlapping damage from the status. This would be a problem in Dark Souls, but in Warframe, not so much. Unless you're in a melee-only mission, which are few and far between, you carry 3 weapons, so you can easily have melee influence on your melee and then a single target focused secondary or primary. Additionally, influence setups obviously scale high status and status damage. So you can get a lot of single target by simply using it on a weapon that procs a lot of slash. The slash won't be spread by influence, it cannot spread physical status effects, but it will add some much needed single target damage. These kinds of weapons generally make the best, most well-rounded influence setups, though the most ridiculous influence setups tend to come from weapons like the Duo Vicus, which has innate gas damage, so you can go gas, blast, and electricity, which is this times 3. The main power of Influence is of course the amount of damage it does and the area in which it does that damage. This will easily clear multiple rooms with a single well-placed proc. But also in how easy it is to run. If a weapon has 10-15% status chance, you can usually get enough scaling to run Influence, whether that be through things like Weeping Wounds and scale off of combo counter, or just raw status mods. So all in all, if a weapon has decent enough status and can trigger and sustain Influence, it will most likely be the strongest option for it. Melee Afflictions can drop from Sisters of Parvos that are summoned during the elevator ride in Ascension, or it can be bought from Ordis in Drifter's Camp for 10 vestigial motes a pop. It triggers when an enemy is knocked down, flung, or lifted by your melee attacks, and it will add 6 additional stacks to any status effect they have on them, including the status that was procced by the melee attack that knocked them down, flung, or lifted them. This is a very strong, bursty arcane, but it requires the right kind of weapon and stance. Some stances have a lot of knockdowns and lifts, some don't, though one kind of setup works with it every time. A heavy slam setup, because those guarantee a lift on any enemy they hit. The main downside of Afflictions is that it doesn't work on enemies that are immune to crowd control. So enemies with Overguard or bosses, usually the strongest ones, unfortunately. The best use for melee Afflictions is on weapons that have a forced slash proc and then either a knockdown, ragdoll, or lift on their heavy attack. You can see whether or not this is the case by clicking this lovely button over here and checking the heavy attack on the stance. The reason why heavy slash setups are the best with Afflictions is because most of the time they are very slow and they proc 1 or maybe 2 slash procs per enemy. Afflictions can bring that up to 7 or 8. That is a humongous difference in damage. And the same goes for status-focused heavy slam builds. Afflictions is often the only way to make these work actually, because slam builds, once again, are slow and don't usually proc more than 1 or 2 status effects per heavy slam. So bringing the status proc count from 1 to 2 to 7 to 8 is a massive difference and is build enabling at times. You don't often see it on light attack builds, but it's definitely usable as well. It pairs particularly well with blast on weapons where the stance has a combo with a lift, knockdown or a fling at the end of it. So you proc a bunch of blast throughout the combo and then at the end leave the enemy, which caps the blast and blows it up. It's one of my favorite melee setups actually, feels great. Melee Animosity is a very straightforward arcane. It can drop from the Fragmented Boss on Deimos, it can drop from Whispers in Albrecht Laboratory missions as well as Grazling in non-disruption missions, or it can be bought from Bert for standing in Sanctum Anatomica. It triggers on a melee hit and grants you up to 42% increased crit chance for your next heavy attack, stacking up to 10 times. Now this crit chance is additive to melee crit mods like True Steel and Blood Rush, and the arcane itself is used almost exclusively on crit heavy Tennokai builds that can't run anything else. And I know that sounds kinda bad, but it's true. Pure light builds don't want to randomly heavy attack because they're usually scaling something, whether that be crit or status, off of their combo counter. Hybrid efficiency builds don't make sense anymore because we have Tennokai, which is better and easier to do. And pure heavy attack builds don't usually have enough attack speed to randomly light attack for some bonus crit chance. Plus they get double crit chance from steel mod, so they usually have more than enough. So as I've said already, this is a fallback arcane for crit heavy Tennokai weapons. Basically, if you don't want to trigger Vortex, don't have the overshields for retaliation, it somehow doesn't work for influence, you don't have the casting power for exposure, it has too much crit for duplicate, not enough puncture for Doughty, and you cannot fling, knock down or lift the enemy with afflictions, you run Animosity. It's not that the arcane is bad, 420% bonus crit on your next attack is a lot of crit. It's more that the alternatives are usually better. Well, except for Fortification, that's even lower down the list than Animosity. If it doesn't work with what I just said, and you don't want the crit, then you run Fortification. Melee Crescendo used to be a legendary arcane that's obtainable from Netra cells as well as Deep Arcamedia on rotations A, B and C. It triggers on a finisher kill and grants you up to 6 initial combo for the rest of the mission. This, if you perform enough finishers, allows you to sit at 12 times combo at all times. Kind of. This used to be one of the most expensive arcanes in the game before they made it more common, but also before people realized what I've been shouting at them ever since it came out, which is if you spend 12 times initial combo, it takes forever for it to regenerate. For you see, initial combo regenerates at a rate of 40 points per second. So the combo ticking up to 12x very slowly at the bottom right corner of your screen isn't just a visual thing. This is actually your combo regenerating back up. 12 times combo is 220 hits, so it will take 5.5 seconds to regenerate back up to full, meaning that if you're relying on initial combo to do full damage on a heavy attack build, you can only do full damage every 5.5 seconds. So it's only good or usable for setups that prefer 12 times combo. They either can't generate the combo or you don't want to generate the combo on the weapon itself, and they don't need to heavy attack all that often. If you put this on a heavy glyph prime build and you throw it as soon as it comes back, you will never do full damage. So it's actually a very niche arcane that you're not gonna run on too many weapons. It is, however, really damn good in combination with the secondary Outburst arcane, which when you switch from your melee to your secondary weapon consumes your entire combo and grants you a ton of crit chance and crit damage. It's also weapon specific, so if for example you put it on an exalted melee weapon and stack your initial combo there, it won't transfer over to your normal melee weapon. So it's for the most part used as a single target backup arcane, so you use an AoE primary or secondary, and then if you run into a beefy enemy you can switch to your melee weapon, which is already a 12 times combo, and do a really chunky heavy attack. It's also pretty good for setups that group enemies up first, so you can spend the 5.5 seconds it takes for your combo to regenerate grouping enemies up and then hit them with a big heavy attack or heavy slam. Or it's good for weapons that have unique heavy attack mechanics that don't require you to heavy attack all that often. A great example of this would be the Zenistar. Melee Doughty is a relatively new arcane that can be bought from Eleanor, may be rewarded from the 1999 calendar, can drop from Tekrot saves in Holvania missions as well as Skaldra caches in Holvania Exterminate missions. It may drop from the H09 FR1 tank, can be rewarded from Holvania face-off missions, and finally it can drop from the Skaldra Screamer in Stage Defense. It grants you up to 1x crit multiplier for every 10% chance to proc puncture on your melee weapon. So it's an extremely niche arcane that's only usable on crit heavy weapons that do primarily puncture damage and do not want to run elemental damage. Because modding the weapon with elemental damage of any kind takes away your chance to proc puncture. You need to be extremely careful when building for melee Doughty, because using any buff like Nourish that adds elemental damage to your weapon will make this worse. This is almost never the way to go on the vast majority of melee weapons. It requires a very specific weapon with a very specific setup. That will look something like this, just damage, crit, status, and puncture. That's it. The problem with Doughty is that it's rarely worth it even on weapons that do primarily puncture and have a lot of crit. This is because elemental damage, the status that comes from elemental damage, and the mods that provide you elemental damage are really strong. So most of the time it needs something special. A great example of this is one of the most disgusting melee setups that I own, Doughty Ceramic Dagger. It's the one you're watching right now. The reason it works on the Ceramic Dagger is because it does primarily puncture without any slash, just a little bit of impact, so you can easily build it for Doughty. But when you activate Incarnon, heavy attacks will throw out daggers that do heat. So we can easily get over 1000% increased crit damage from Doughty, but utilize it with the heat daggers that come from Incarnon heavy attacks. Melee Duplicate is another previously legendary arcane that can be rewarded from Netra cells as well as Deep Archimedia rotations A, B, and C. It triggers on a base critical hit, so a yellow crit, and it gives you an up to 100% chance to hit twice. This arcane is good on weapons with mediocre crit, because if you can set it up right, this arcane essentially makes you do double damage. The cool thing about Duplicate is that the secondary hit is a hit of its own, so it will roll its own probabilities. It will look at it and go, is this a normal hit, yellow crit, or even an orange crit, and does it proc status or not? If the original hit force procced a status, like a heavy attack detonation or a glyph prime, the secondary hit will do the same. This is why it's generally better and more used on weapons that either have very high status chance and a desirable forced proc, like the glyph prime on its heavy attack, which force procs slash. You do have to be careful about puncture though, because puncture makes enemies easier to crit, so if you mod your weapon to have roughly around 100% crit chance but then carpet bomb the enemies with puncture proc and fully stack them, you will start orange critting and Duplicate won't do anything. With that said though, put that keyboard down, I know what you're typing, most if not all Duplicate setups actually want to have above 100% crit chance because of what I said earlier. Duplicated hits reroll their probabilities, so they can orange crit. And depending on your weapon's modded crit multiplier, it becomes increasingly more worth it to not duplicate every single hit to give some of the duplicated hits chance to orange crit. There's even a formula you can use to calculate your ideal crit chance with rank 5 Duplicate. It's your crit chance is equal to 3 times crit damage multiplier minus 4 divided by 2 times your crit damage multiplier minus 2. If we put in some numbers, you will see that as the modded crit multiplier grows, so does the ideal crit chance. So yeah, there's quite a lot of nuance with Duplicate, but it's generally, as I've said already, best on weapons with mediocre crit chance that can't really push heavy into orange or red crit tiers, and it works really well with weapons that either have very high status chance or have desirable forced status procs. Melee Exposure is a rather generic arcane that can be awarded by killing the fragmented boss on Deimos. It can drop from Whispers in Albrecht laboratory missions or Graslings in Node Disruption missions, or alternatively it can be bought from Bird 3 for standing in Sanctum Anatomica. It triggers on an ability cast and grants your melee weapon bonus 60% corrosive damage for 25 seconds, and it can be stacked up to 240%. This, because it's so generic, works on pretty much every melee weapon you put it on, and it's sustainable by all Warframes because 25 seconds is a long time. It's best used for heavy hitting direct damage setups because you don't want the corrosive damage to get in the way of you proccing damaging status effects instead, or setups that are very tight on mod space and can't fit in enough elemental damage. It's generally fantastic for bossing because you want big damage, right? Making your way to the boss, you're not scared because it's gonna be at a loss when you blow it up. I'm gonna stop now. You can just stack it up as you're running to the boss, and most bosses and mini bosses are also status resistant, so you want to take them down with big raw upfront damage. Think of this as like melee merciless. It's usually not the best, but it will work on pretty much everything. It also works like infusion buffs, so if you have electricity or toxin on the weapon, it will leave them alone and not combine with them. And that's all there is to say about exposure, really. It's pretty good. Melee Fortification is a strictly defensive arcane that can drop from the Fragmented boss on Deimos, can drop from Whispers in Albrecht Laboratory missions or Groslings in Non-Disruption missions, or alternatively can be bought from Bird 3 for standing in Sanctum Anatomica. It triggers on a melee kill and grants you up to 210 armor for 10 seconds. The cool thing about Fortification is that it basically doesn't have a cap at all. You can get the buff 255 times, which you're not going to do in a 10-second period. I know I've dunked on Fortification earlier, but it's not useless. Getting this much flat armor per kill is not negligible. This is a lot of defense, especially on squishier frames that might not have much armor to begin with. You can add a very chunky layer of defense with melee Fortification. The problem with Fortification are the Arcanes it's going up against. Would you rather run Fortification and get a nice chunk of armor, or Influence and explode every enemy in the room whenever you swing your melee weapon? So unfortunately, most of the time, melee Fortification is the ultimate backup arcane. Like, if nothing else works, you might as well put on Fortification and get some armor. Melee Retaliation once again drops from the Fragmented boss on Deimos. It can drop from Whispers in Albrecht Laboratories as well as Groslings in Non-Disruption missions, and can be bought from Bird 3 for standing in the Sanctum Anatomica. It's active at all times and grants you 30% generic melee damage for every 200 current shields you have, up to a maximum of 420% bonus melee damage. Also, while it does work for overshields, they only provide half the bonus melee damage. Because the bonus it provides is generic melee damage, it's additive and therefore competes with mods like Pressure Point and Condition Overload. So if you're using this arcane, you ideally want to avoid double stacking the same multiplier and not run Pressure Point or Condition Overload, which means that 99% of the time, Retaliation will save you a mod slot and is great for builds that are tight on mod space. Now, to take full advantage of Retaliation and get the full buff, your Warframe needs at least 2800 shields or 2200 shields and full overshields. And it needs to be able to upkeep that, because it's calculated off of current shields, not total shields. This, unsurprisingly, restricts it to Warframes with big shield pools, though it has been made more usable with the addition of Primed Redirection. Now, while it does save you a mod slot, and the amount of damage it provides is very, very high, it's only really rivaled with Condition Overload against a fully primed enemy, it's almost never used because melee weapons very rarely need more power than they get from Primed Pressure Point or Condition Overload. There are some niche weapons that allow it to shine, like the Rakta Dark Dagger, which actively helps you sustain shields and overshields because it restores 5% shields and can grant overshields when hitting enemies that are affected by radiation procs, but it's again very rarely used, not necessarily because the arcane is bad or anything, it's more that the competition is just too good. So it ends up being a niche arcane that you run on high shield frames when you need to save a mod slot on your melee weapon. And the final arcane on the menu today is Melee Vortex, which is once again obtained from the Fragmented boss on Deimos. It can drop from Whispers in Albrecht Laboratories or Groslings in Non-Disruption missions, can be bought from Bird 3 for standing in Sanctum Anatomica, but it can also drop from Captain Vor in the mission Tolstoy on Mercury on Steel Path. It gives you an up to 45% chance to trigger on killing an enemy affected by a magnetic proc, and it creates a vortex that pulls in all enemies in an 18-meter radius. The best thing about Vortex is that it doesn't care where the magnetic proc came from, whether it be your pet, another weapon, or even your frame. So you're not required to mod your melee weapon for magnetic. Vortex, for me at least, is one of the most used arcanes aside from Influence. It's absolutely tremendous for AoE heavy melee setups that rely on either gas, electricity, blast, or some mechanic that causes a big explosion, or just have a lot of range and good follow through. And it's almost essential, I would say, for horde mode style missions if you don't play frames that have good grouping abilities. It works on light attack builds, heavy attack builds, Tennokai builds, hell, even slam builds. It's also one of the arcanes that can be used as pure utility. My setup needs to group enemies up and it has no way to group enemies up. What do? Vortex. That's what I do. I like it the most on Tennokai builds because I can proc Vortex with my light attacks, and as soon as a heavy attack procs, I can swing it right into the Vortex. So while it doesn't directly add any power to the melee weapon, it's actually one of the more useful arcanes you can run. So there you go, those are all the melee arcanes that we currently have in the game. Zo arcanes are going to be covered in a separate video because they don't fit on normal melee weapons and they're very different, so I feel like they deserve their own video. I thank you very much for watching, as always guys, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. And I would also like to extend a special thank you to all the channel members. Thank you very much guys, I really appreciate your support, it means a lot to me. And I'll see you next time, bye bye.